Professor Richard Wörner is here to explain important principles of economics, in particular about economic growth. Professor Wörner, the fourth quarter of 2010 in the UK showed a slight contraction of economic growth. What could the coalition government do to promote economic growth?
Well, basically, when there's weak growth, governments very quickly say we need government spending, which is fiscal expenditure. And a lot of economists agree, or sometimes investors in the markets demand that. They think that will boost the economy. But there's actually quite a few problems with this. One, of course, is the problem that we experience in many industrialized countries, certainly the UK, the US, many other countries. We've already got a lot of government debt, and therefore it's very hard to spend even more, deficit spending, increasing national debt. All this debt has to be serviced at interest, so it's very, very costly. There is a much more efficient way to boost the economy and deliver growth, which doesn't have this burden of compounding interest and national debt on it. And that is, of course, through the monetary system.
Right.
Now, what is the link between the monetary system or monetary factors and money growth and economic growth? Well, actually, if you think about it, what actually is growth? The way we define growth, GDP commonly is the way we look at it. Really, when we say we've got GDP growth this year of X%, this means that this year we've got more transactions in the economy than last year. Now, for transactions to take place, money has to change hands. Well, in practice, right, the majority of money is through bank transfers, so maybe it's not even changing hands, it's just changing bank accounts. But the money is flowing in the economy. And therefore, to have growth, we must have more money being used for transactions. Now, the type of economic system we have and financial system we have dictates that certain things about this. How is it possible to have more money changing hands for transactions? Where does it come from? Somebody has to create this money and allocate it. Now, most people, when we talk about the money supply and how money is created, think, well, of course, this comes from the government or the central bank. And most people are quite surprised to hear that in most countries, the tangible money, notes and coins that comes from the central bank is only 2 or 3% of the money supply. So
right, so that's but then that's called money, but it's not the whole of the money that is around. That's what you're saying. It's a very small part of the money supply.
So actually the notes and coins are more or less a drop in the ocean of economic transactions that we have in the economy. Where does the majority come from? Who creates 97% of the money supply in most countries? Well, nowadays we have debates about whether we should privatize hospitals, whether we should privatize prisons, whether we should privatize almost everything. And at least there's, well, a certain amount of debate about it and a certain amount of quite sensible resistance to these ideas. But few people realize that the biggest privatization has happened a long time ago of something that most people think should never have been privatized. And that is the creation and allocation of the money supply. This is actually done by private, profit-oriented enterprises. Who are they? The banks. They create the money supply. 98% of the money supply. So, back to the point we want to talk about, we want to analyze how we can stimulate growth. Well, in the system that we have, which is not necessarily the best system, but the system that we have, we just need to get the banks to create more credit. This will add to the money supply. And as long as banks create credit, and this is used for productive purposes, for the production of goods and services that have a value and there's demand for them, will be non-inflationary, will lead to economic growth without inflation. Now, that's a better way of promoting growth, to get the banks to create credit for productive purposes. Of course, there's some other even better ways, but I think we'll talk about them later.
Right. So governments have pleaded with banks to create new credit for productive purposes, but to no great success. So there's obviously something wrong somewhere.
Yes, this is what happened after the financial crisis in the US and the UK, particularly in Europe, the UK, France, Germany, where banking systems had to be bailed out. Governments, almost as an afterthought, said, oh, well, actually, we should have asked for something in return for bailing them out with billions. They should actually lend more to small firms and to the economy and be helpful, which is the right idea. Well, governments, central banks, could always ask for this, and there are ways of doing it. The way the government has done it in the UK is not very effective.
Perhaps we'll move on to that one in the next session.
Absolutely.
Yeah. On our next video, Professor Wörner will talk about how the banking system could work to produce sustainable economic growth.